everyone, and welcome to the next episode of our Small Sit virtual series featuring Evan Dalton, Director of Landbird Conservation here at Manomet Conservation Sciences, who's here to talk to us about backyard birds today. I am Jean O'Rourke, Manomet Senior Director of Marketing Communications, and I'll be your MC today. If you're new to Manomet Conservation Sciences, a little background on our organization. We use science and collaboration to reverse shorebird decline, promote coastal resilience, and educate and inspire the next generation of conservationists across the Western Hemisphere. And if you're a friend, volunteer, trustee, counselor, or donor to Manomet already, then thank you. It's only with your support that we can continue to get our hands dirty doing hands-on science in collaboration with local partners. And just a couple of housekeeping notes for today's webinar. First, we'd love attendees to type into the chat where you're all Zooming from. Then after that, we're going to reserve the chat for any tech issues you might be having. And we welcome your curiosity, so please type any questions you have into the Q&A box, and Evan will be happy to answer them at the end of the presentation as time allowed. We at Manomet have been talking a lot about shorebirds these past couple months in our No Boundaries Shorebird campaign, but today we turn our attention to landbirds. Some of you may know Evan Dalton already from joining his very popular First Friday Bird Walks at Manomet headquarters. Evan came to Manomet in 2008, and now, as part of the environmental education and outreach team, he's a passionate and incredibly knowledgeable ornithologist and runs the bird banding lab as Director of Landbird Conservation. Evan, floor is yours. Take it away.
Thanks, Jean. Welcome everyone. Thanks for coming out on your lunch breaks or whatever you're doing. I don't know what time zones everyone's in, but I guess we can probably extrapolate that from the chat. Yeah, I guess it's the time of year when things are particularly exciting for us here in the northeastern U.S. Here at Manomet, we just started our spring banding session, so we're very excited about that. Encourage people to come out to, as Jean said, our Friday morning bird walks, but also just get out and enjoy the movement of birds as you go through. Yeah, I guess right now, today, we're going to be talking about backyard birds, and apologies for this being sort of a more, I guess, mm, is that working for everyone?
Yes, Evan, we see this sidebar, so if you want to change it to...
Okay, sorry, it's being
Okay.
weird.
Hey, now I
We'll
see
try it
you.
this way.
Great.
Here, slideshow. Cool. All right. Is
You
that
got it.
better?
You got
Awesome. Thanks. Sorry, everyone. I'm a Luddite when it comes to technology,
it.
which is great. It helps that I work with birds. They don't care about computers. Um, awesome. Okay, so today, again, apologies. This is sort of backyard bird centric and kind of backyard birds for the northeastern part of North America. But today, our plan is to talk a little bit about population trends of birds that we're seeing here in the Northeast. We'll talk about shifting phenology, which sort of seasonal changes, and how birds might be responding to climate change. And then also we're going to talk about what we can do for birds. So these are actions that people can take that might help migratory and resident birds in their area. I should say that the banding lab that I oversee has been around for over 50 years. So the data that we'll be talking about and a lot of these trends will be informed by that information. So a question I get all the time, how are the birds doing? Well, the answer is it's pretty complicated, and you kind of have to get more fine-grained than that. But if you want to take the bird's eye view of that, the birds aren't doing so great. So in the case of North American birds, uh, you know, the declines in North American birds have been sort of brought to the forefront in the last few years. There's been a pretty big push in scientific literature that's come out in support of most of the things that people anecdotally have been seeing for years. So this big paper in Science came out, and about a year later, we actually published our own data showing the changes in the birds that move through our banding station. So in the case of our data, I can show you some of those numbers here. They're basically looking at about 50 years worth of data, and these are some common backyard birds that are relatively short distance migrants. So these are anything from the blue jay on the left, the white-throated sparrow in the middle, and the eastern towhee on the right. And you can kind of see these graphs, and I apologize if they're a little small, but I wanted to fit both the spring and fall numbers in there. So spring is on top and fall is on the bottom. And that blue line in the middle, the dark line in the middle, is basically showing the generalized trend. And the gray areas around everything are basically our wiggle room. That's in science what we call a confidence interval. But essentially, you can see that with all three of these species, both spring and fall, we've seen pretty steep declines in them, particularly for something like the eastern towhee. But those declines kind of bottom out for several of these species. And for some of them, including the eastern towhee, there's even a slight uptick. So if we continued that line past where it is to the last 4 or 5 years, there is a slight uptick, particularly in the spring, in eastern towhee numbers. Um, but these declines in birds are generally attributed to several different factors. There's habitat loss. If you're a migratory bird, that habitat loss is amplified in some ways, and that those birds require various other areas as sort of gas stations or stopover habitat on their journeys north and south each year. They also have, oftentimes they'll have territories on their wintering grounds as well. So habitat loss can be a big factor here. We'll talk about some other things that migratory birds encounter on their journeys in when we talk about what we can do for bird populations. But in general, this is sort of the trend we see. Like I said, I'm aiming this more at backyard birds that people might be familiar with, but if we look at other species that are longer distance migrants, things that we call neotropical migrants, so those are things that essentially leave North America uh, when they're not breeding. Um, Things like American redstarts, many of the wood warblers, flycatchers, those species are all in pretty steep declines as well. Um, but it's not all entirely bad news. So in some cases, we are seeing upticks in birds or have seen upticks in birds. So two of the more common backyard birds here in New England are the northern cardinal on the left and the Carolina wren on the right. And as you can see, both of those birds have gone up pretty significantly over the last several decades. Um, and that's because one, they don't migrate. So they're not facing all those challenges that migratory birds may face. But also they're seeing more and more habitats. So in the case of the northern cardinal and the Carolina wren, they both like to be around humans. Um, Northern cardinals love a lot of the shrubs, particularly invasive shrubs that are planted around people's backyards. And if you looked at the number of backyards in the Northeast over the last 50 years, I'm sure it's going up even more significantly than either of these species. Carolina wrens also like to build their nests in man-made structures, underneath eaves, sometimes in people's pants on their clotheslines. They're pretty industrious. They build lots of nests and only choose one. Um, but they also are doing quite well. But you'll notice that their trend line, particularly in the spring, shows a lot of variability. And that's basically because each one of those areas in time where the population sort of dips down is following a particularly snowy winter. So I don't know if you can see my cursor here, but there's a dip there in about 2006, in the spring of 2006, and then also in the spring of 2015, 16. And that, if you lived in the Northeast, was what was affectionately known as a snowmageddon, where we had snow everywhere and they couldn't get rid of it enough. And in years when there's a lot of heavy snow cover, that actually kills back Carolina wrens in the Northeast. So they, unlike cardinals with their nice seed crunching bills, are unable to really take advantage of feeding stations for a significant portion of their diet, and they rely upon finding food under leaf litter with their long bill. So they spend a lot of time on the ground, flipping leaves, looking for food. But you can imagine if there are 2 feet of snow, Carolina wren's not going to last too long in those conditions. So this is pretty compelling evidence in our eyes of a species where their journey north. So with both of these species, their ranges are expanding northwards. Um, but where their journey north really is limited by weather, and it's also facilitated by weather. So kind of interesting little patterns there. Um, Speaking about sort of changing seasonality and all of that, when we first started banding birds here, we were just placing bands on birds and in the hopes of getting recoveries of those bands somewhere else. Those initial data points of where our birds came from and where they went allowed us to establish the ideas or really sort of helped North American ornithology solidify the ideas of flyways and figure out where the flyways were. So those are sort of generalized migratory pathways that birds take on their journeys. Um, but since then, we've been basically, you can see these trends here. These are all predicated on the fact that we've been banding birds consistently in the same dates in the same way with the same techniques for so long that we're actually able to control year after year and really detect changes in not only the numbers of birds we're catching, which we just looked at, but we can also look at timing of these birds and how that timing might be changing as the seasons change too. So it's spring here in the Northeast, and many of the birds that are headed through here are snapping up tiny little caterpillars. This is a female black-throated green warbler that I photographed in Maine in May. And you can see she's got a absolutely tiny little green caterpillar. Now, I have a photo of this same bird from about 2 seconds prior, and you can't tell that this caterpillar, it's not in her mouth at the time, it's in this bud right here. And you can't tell from my photo even that that caterpillar is there. But that bird is able to find these things so effectively. And caterpillars represent a major source of fuel for birds on their northward journey. Now, caterpillars really only come out when the leaves are young and fresh. So basically, birds have to really make sure that they're going to get to stopover habitat right when the getting is good and when their food peaks, if that makes sense. So if we think of it as these graphs down here, if the prey would be caterpillars and their abundance is coming up, the birds want to plan their arrival for when there's plenty of food, and basically they're trying to maximize this overlap space down here. You can imagine if it's a particularly early year then, so this prey area is shifted to the left to an earlier year, then if that bird arrives at the same time, that amount of overlap is going to be far less. So this is something that we call an ecological mismatch, and it's something that we're trying to track here on our property. We currently, right now, as I speak, have a bunch of high school students going down and looking at plant phenology on our farm. So that's pretty cool. Um, but yeah, we're quite sure that this ecological mismatch is playing into the survivorship of certain species that are unable to adapt to the sort of randomness that has come out of climate change. Some people call it global weirding, which instead of global warming. But it's definitely something where every year it seems like, oh, well, this is a weird year, or this is a weird year. And when there isn't that consistency that birds evolved to rely upon, their ability to adapt is being tested. So we actually find that some birds will arrive earlier in warmer years. So one of those species would be the white-throated sparrow here, which we found comes back about a day earlier um, in response to 1 degree warmer. So if on average, if the winter is 1 degree warmer than average, they'll come back a day earlier than average. Other species that overwinter much further south than the white-throated sparrow. White-throated sparrows might only be coming from the mid-Atlantic from here to here. But the magnolia warbler actually overwinters in Central America and in the Caribbean. And so its cues for how warm a year it is are kind of non-existent. And they basically don't come back earlier in warmer years, not surprisingly. And so you can imagine the possibility for mismatch on longer distance migratory birds is much higher than you might see with something like this white-throated sparrow. Um, One last thing about phenology that's kind of cool because it's new research that we're contributing our data to. Where I've been providing uh, subsets of our data to collaborators at the University of Maryland's Appalachian Research Station. They recently published a paper, and we're working on publishing another one right now. That's basically, this is dizzying, I know, but from my perspective, this is like I could stare at this forever. But this is basically taking all of our banding stations data, and whenever we capture a bird, we also keep track of what net that bird's in and what time we caught it. So not only do we have hundreds of thousands of bird records, we also have dates, times, and locations for each of those birds. And they've been able to plug several million records, not just ours, but records from Long Point Bird Observatory in Ontario, Bird Observatory in Michigan, uh, Powder Mill in Pennsylvania, I believe Appledore Island, and Braddock Bay, and it's basically an amazing set of data, and they pulled out this really incredible set of figures that kind of show the strength of connections between species pairs. So for a long time, people have anecdotally recognized that, oh, this bird kind of arrives at the same time this bird does. But what this is actually showing is not only do those birds arrive around the same time, but that they're more likely than not captured in the same area at the same time as other species. So in the spring, for instance, we look down here, this is a magnolia warbler. And apologies for the banding codes, but if they spelled everything out, it would be too many words, too many letters. But magnolia warblers have a particularly strong connection with American redstarts and with chestnut-sided warblers. And so this is saying that they're most likely, and in fact incredibly likely, to be captured um, in the same areas at the same time. In the fall, you see things like myrtle warblers, ruby-crowned kinglets, and white-throated sparrows. The white-throated sparrow we were talking about earlier, they're often captured together as well. What we're looking at right now and what we're about to publish is basically taking these relationships and seeing how they've changed over time. And basically, not just looking at an ecological mismatch between birds and their prey, but also between one species of bird and another species of bird. So, what they found is that more likely than not, most of the species pairs here have changed over the last 40 or 50 years. And even in some cases, they've changed in as few as 20 years in some of the banding stations. So you have to think, oh, well, if a magnolia warbler and a redstart are often together, foraging together as they migrate through stopover habitat, there has to be some reason for that. So do they forage in the same way? Are they able to look out for predators more effectively if the two of them are together? But if that relationship is being strained because one of them is arriving earlier than another, or one of them is adapting more to a warming climate than another, um, then you have to think that these effects may continue to sort of snowball. So maybe it's not just that they're not finding enough food. Maybe now they're not able to effectively create the most ideal mixed species flock as they move through areas, and so they're not as capable of navigating the terrain as they were before. So interesting stuff. It's a bit in the weeds though. And obviously, not all of us are going to be playing around with large data sets, but you may be wondering what you can do to help migratory birds. So as birds shift from, or as birds try to adapt to a climate and a world that is changing and more random, there are things that we can do to help try to make um, or maximize their ability to adapt, I guess I should say. So try to make it as friendly a place as you can for them. Um, so in our case, I would strongly suggest promoting uh, stopover habitat. So in this case, planting native plants is a huge deal. We know through our research here that birds very much prefer food from native plants. Native plants have much higher loads of insects on them, which those birds need in the spring and summer. In the spring, they're using it for fuel. In the summer, they're feeding their young. And then native plants also provide, many of them provide berries in the fall, which the birds use as fuel too. It's crazy to think, but a lot of our native bushes here in the Northeast, when they produce berries, those berries not only have sugar, which is very short-term energy, but a lot of them also have fats and proteins, which are things that birds use to pack on fat and breast muscle right before they take off for flight. A lot of invasive species and even introduced shrubs that produce berries. The berries might look nice in your landscape, but they don't serve nearly as much of ecological use as native plants. So highly recommend planting native plants for because it helps birds in the spring, summer, and fall in the northern hemisphere. So definitely an amazing thing you can do. Now, if you don't have access to a spot where you can plant native plants, and I get it, a lot of people don't, um, it's possible to join like a local garden club and help promote native plants in that way. A lot of places have like sponsor, a lot of businesses and whatnot sponsor like median strips and things like that around roads. You can even create bird habitat there. Um, as birds, particularly land birds, so a lot of the shorebird work we do is to identify individual sites that are very important for large groups of migrating shorebirds. Um, there's just less coastline than there is potential for stopover habitat for land birds. And so those coastal sites tend to get they're sort of like bottlenecks for migratory birds. And so it's super important. And the work we're doing is very critical in identifying those sites. Stopover habitat for a bird like an American redstart is very different. And they don't often visit the same stopover site year after year. They're basically just looking for a good gas station that they're going to. And they don't really care what brand they're shopping at. They just want to make sure that there's going to be enough food for them to fuel up and shelter and water if they can get it. So it doesn't take much to create or to provide a service to a migrating bird. Even one plant, one shrub, anything can be a little snack that can help them get through some stuff. Like I said, water is a great way to help out migrating birds and resident birds as well. They'll often, as they migrate, they want to be washing their feathers as well to make sure that their feathers are in tip-top shape. So that's a helpful thing. The no pesticides bit is something that this is a trend I've seen a ton in the Northeast. The number of services out there that promise to eradicate mosquitoes from your yard has ballooned quite significantly. Um, but this is an image of someone from one of those companies going out and spraying a natural substance onto someone's yard in an attempt to kill mosquitoes. But you'll notice he's spraying during the day, wearing a mask so he doesn't inhale something that's listed as incredibly safe. And he's spraying it right onto looks like a zinnia and someone's garden patch there. So I don't know. It's not a very effective way to prevent mosquitoes. It is a great way to kill every insect in your yard that's sitting on a surface. And if you have no insects in your yard, the birds aren't going to be able to find food to feed their young or food to fuel up their journey. So, not really the greatest thing for migratory birds. Um, what else can we do? So these are things that we can help create habitat for migrating birds. There are also some things that we could do that alter our lifestyle in a minor way that might have pretty big impacts. So things like drinking bird-friendly coffee. Your coffee doesn't have to be specifically bird-friendly, but even shade-grown coffee, shade-grown coffee plantations offer far more habitat for migratory birds than just your typical run-of-the-mill coffee plantation. A coffee plantation is just coffee plants and nothing else. It's kind of like a cornfield in the tropics. So, it's not really offering a huge service, ecological service for the birds that are down there. And it's something that, Americans drink more coffee than probably any other country. I don't know the numbers on it, but it's definitely part of everyone's morning routine. But wouldn't it be nice if you're drinking your coffee and going out and listening to the birds singing to know that like, oh yeah, this coffee was grown in a spot where like maybe this coffee bean grew in a plant that was fertilized by a golden wing warbler. Like that would be pretty cool. But if it was grown in just a full sun coffee plantation, the odds of that pretty low, and that coffee came at the cost of bird habitat, which isn't so great. Um, Other things are like just being aware of some of the sort of troublesome foods that are out there. So agricultural practices often warrant clear cutting or require clear cutting a lot of great bird habitat. So things like palm oil, or I've recently learned that dragon fruit, which is what this photo in the bottom left image, dragon fruit is grown in Central America, and they basically remove a whole bunch of really prime uh, habitat for native wildlife and for migratory wildlife in order to plant these massive cactus plants. But they've grown them to they've created them to such a degree that the native pollinators for these plants are gone now. So someone has to go out and hand pollinate these cactuses to get dragon fruits. And when I asked sort of who the main importer of dragon fruit was, it was the US. And I don't know, like most grocery stores in the Northeast you can probably find a dragon fruit, but who actually buys dragon fruit? I feel like ignoring dragon fruit for the rest of your life, I think, is something that's a pretty easy step you can take and might be helpful for migratory birds. And the last one is one that I think people are probably fairly familiar with. It's that outdoor cats are a pretty major killer of not just birds, but a lot of wildlife. And so keeping a cat indoors is something that you can do not just for the birds, but I think also for your cat itself. Life expectancy of an outdoor cat is something like 2, 3 years less on average than a cat that's indoors. And I think a lot of people like to think that when their cats are outdoors, they're being it's more like they're getting back to their roots or something. But domestic cats, I believe, originated in the desert. So unless you live in the desert and your cat is going out and coming back every few days just for water, I don't really know how it's a natural thing for your cat. But anyways, this is an image of Lincoln sparrow that was taken in California. And then this is that Lincoln sparrow after it's been killed and eaten by a cat. Uh, these are the same bird. So kind of sad, but again, something that has a pretty big impact on migratory birds' survivorship, and it's something that it's within your control, which is nice. Um, Other things you can do, you can jump on the advocacy train. So There are a lot of movements nowadays to get behind that help birds. So, a big one now is banning rodenticides. So if you've ever like walked around a shopping mall or a school or anything else, you've seen these sort of black bait boxes. Those are full of like nasty chemicals that rats and mice will come in and eat. And it is effective at killing those things, but before they die, they're often picked off by raptors, owls, dogs, cats, local coyotes, other wildlife, and it basically completely messes with the neurological systems of those predatory animals and often results in death. It's pretty rough way to go for those animals, and also those animals are providing an amazing service for us. And what we're doing is kind of making the problem worse by trying to solve the problem with chemicals, if that makes sense. So there's been a lot of moves locally. Manomet is a supporter of Rescue Plymouth Wildlife. It's their logo on the lower right-hand corner. But a lot of towns are starting to get the word out about how bad these rodenticides are. Um, Cities around the world have lights out campaigns now. So a lot of the migratory birds that fly through are doing so at night and they're using stars to navigate. But on cloudy nights, when the stars aren't up above and the only stars that they see are tiny little twinkling lights down below, often birds can get confused by that and will sometimes fly into buildings in great numbers. A lot of cities have sort of lights out campaigns where they prioritize turning lights out on nights when in the spring and fall when there's anticipation of heavy migration that night. Um, you can support green spaces. Like I said, even tiny green spaces offer service for migratory birds. They're stopover habitat for migratory birds. So don't think about it as like preserving giant swaths of land for birds to use as they migrate through. That would be great, but even a tiny little bit of land makes a big difference, not just for birds, but also for the physical and mental health of the people that live in the area that can also take advantage of that. So, supporting your local green spaces is another great way to help migratory birds, among other things. And also, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention you can support your local conservation nonprofit, which Manomet is one. You can certainly support our migratory bird work. We've got a campaign going where you can sponsor a mist net and get a report at the end of the season as to what birds your net caught and all that fun stuff. So that's kind of cool. Let's see. Lastly, just a few other steps, and then I'll open it up for questions. But some other small things. If you do have land that you help manage, or if you're a landowner, you can leave dead trees because they're quite popular with things like woodpeckers. Leaving weedy patches throughout the winter promotes shelter and food for migratory birds. Removing invasive plants because, like I said, they tend not to offer the same benefits that native plants would. You can mitigate window collisions, so a lot of birds, even during the day, run into windows. A great company to look into for that is a company called Feather Friendly that offers several options for basically placing decals on the outside surface of your window to break up that reflectivity. And then lastly, as always, educate yourself and educate others too. I think a lot of people aren't particularly aware of it because it's not really something that most people think about, but there are a lot of challenges that birds face and a lot of things that are in our control and that we can do to, small changes we can do that make a big difference for birds. Um, okay, I think I've talked enough, and I guess I can open things up for questions now.
Fantastic. Thanks, Evan. If anyone, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. I am going to kick it off, if I may. This is a weird technical question, but Evan, during in the slide where you had the two round charts with the migratory pairs,
Hmm.
the names of the birds that have those four letters. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, so those are called banding codes.
Okay.
Basically, every bird that could be banded as part of the North American banding scheme has a set of four letters that can represent that bird's common name, English common name. It's something that's really only used in the circle of bird science, and even then to a limited capacity. I think in the case of that figure, like I said, if they tried to write out every bird's name, it wouldn't have fit. So they had to use the banding codes there. Um,
Who decides that?
the letters,
Yeah.
as with most things birds in North America, it's a group of people that you know that that's like their passion is
Yeah.
to do bird names. It's not necessarily mine, but to each their own. It takes all kinds. And it's nice that we have those because it makes it a lot easier for us to scribe data down really quickly. And even a lot of birders or bird watchers use those four-letter codes if they're creating lists or anything like that. And if you enter things into eBird Mobile,
Mhm.
a hack is you can actually type in the four-letter banding code and the species comes up. You don't have to type out
Oh, handy.
rufous crowned, it'll get there with your banding code.
Okay. All the faster to identify those birds that you see in your backyard. Okay, we have a couple of questions. One from Colleen. She says she envisions adding many birdhouses to her yard. Are birdhouses beneficial or disruptive to migratory birds?
Yeah, great question. So, bird houses and also bird feeders are things that I think, if done in a manner that's responsible, I think that they can be very helpful. A lot of species rely upon cavities, natural cavities to nest in, but obviously those are pretty hard to come by if, in the case like one of the points I made that you can do for migratory birds is just leaving dead trees up. Well, oftentimes dead trees are removed just because they're a safety hazard, let alone the times that they're removed because they're sort of unsightly. But leaving dead trees or what we call snags is a great way to just provide like a natural bird house for birds. In cases where you can't leave a dead tree up or you don't have a dead tree, you can certainly put up bird houses. I just put up a handful of bird houses at a local golf course that are intended for tree swallows, bluebirds, or anything else that'll move in. Um, but I think just being aware of the requirements of of the species you're trying to attract is important. I think it's Neighborhood Nest Watch has a whole bunch of information on the right sizes and orientations and heights for birdhouses. So that's a great place where you can get free plans as well for making your own birdhouse if you're handy. But that's certainly a thing that can help. Some species that typically nested in cavities, like purple martins, east of the Mississippi now, they almost exclusively nest in man-made birdhouses, not anywhere else. So that's a species that entirely relies upon birdhouses for their survival out here.
Okay, thank you. How about, oh, Sarah, I had mentioned those circular charts with the migratory pairs. Sarah says, can you give us just a quick explanation of how to read those two circular charts?
Sure. I could try to get it back up if, let me see. Okay, I'm working on it. Um, yeah, so yeah, it's a lot to absorb. Let's see, is that working now?
Let me turn my video off and see.
Okay.
Yep, there it is.
Okay. Yeah, so it's a lot to absorb, but basically for every one of these species, there's a line connecting it to each other species. And depending on how bold or how thick that line is, the thicker the line, the stronger the relationship is between those species.
Hmm.
So that's why I mentioned magnolia warbler and American redstart, the amory and the mawa. Those two are pretty closely or pretty tightly linked compared to something like a brown thrasher and a ruby crowned kinglet, which Not super surprising if you're a birder, because a brown thrasher is going to be hopping around on the ground, flipping leaves, and a ruby crowned kinglet's going to be flitting around in the mid to upper story of a tree. So, uh, very different feeding strategies, as well as different, possibly different migration phenology as well. So, as Gene put in, phenology is just the study of seasonal changes, or seasonal phenomena. So in the case of us, bird migration is one of the most important aspects of phenology that we look at here at Manomet.
Thanks, Evan. I had to look up that technology word, not
Yeah,
being
no,
a
I'm sorry.
scientist.
I apologize
It's
for not
okay.
for not explaining.
Let's see. John says he was away from Minimate Point for about 20 years, was surprised by how much development had gone on. Anything in the data that indicates you may be trapping less because the habitat is less attractive now?
Yeah, great question. So that is actually a good example of that Eastern Towhee graph that I showed earlier. There's a very steep drop off between the 1970s to the 1990s, and that's when the local pine barrens are being developed quite extensively. Now there's a whole bunch of housing developments in there, and Manomet was instrumental in working with the development company to ensure small patches of habitat in there. So at least you can still walk around and encounter eastern towhees, but a lot of real estate was removed uh, from the perspective of the eastern towhees. So that's one of the nuances of when you just look at data from our location and if you're not pooling data like we are more recently. You can be subject to local trends in bird populations too. And so that's probably what's happening with
Mhm.
almost certainly what we're seeing or what we have seen with eastern towhees.
Okay,
Great
thanks,
question.
Evan. Lisa asks, what can people with only apartment decks or balconies do to help the birds?
Yeah, great question. So, um, certain things you can do, like you can provide bird feeders out there. I wouldn't necessarily, if it's a deck with someone below you, maybe don't do bird seed because your below deck neighbors will hate you. Um, but something you can put out is a hummingbird feeder, particularly in early spring and late fall, as well as maybe even like we just had Baltimore Orioles just showed up here at Manomet, and they're visiting a jelly feeder of all things. So,
Oh,
bird
there's a
feeders.
question about the about our Orioles really attracted to grape jelly and oranges.
We just saw one on our jelly feeder yesterday.
Huh,
So, yep, grape jelly. And try to get something that's like, you know,
more
n
natural.
not the one that's in the squeeze bottle with the peanut butter. Although they
What,
probably would eat that too. I don't know, but
and Evan, is
um,
it true about is the red dye in the hummingbird feeders? What's the deal with that? I had heard that
it's
wasn't great.
It's not necessary.
Okay.
I don't know if the FDA is going to crack down on that for hummingbirds, probably not. Um, but yeah, what I use at home is just a simple 1 to 4 ratio of sugar to water. So 4 parts water, 1 part sugar.
Do you boil it or
And
just mix it?
yeah, you basically boil it to mix it and kind of let it sanitize a little bit, but
Mhm.
you definitely want to be changing it pretty frequently. So I really only make about a cup at a time,
Uh,
because you don't want to let it sit for a long time because then it will get bad.
how often should you
Um,
change it? We have one at home, is why I asked.
uh, I'd say probably once a week.
Oh, okay.
But if it when it gets really hot and humid out, it might get funky faster.
Okay.
Whereas if it's really cold out, you might not need to change it as much. Or if the hummingbirds are just crushing it all the time, then you're gonna have to change it anyways.
Right. All right, let's do two more questions before we close this out. One is what's the typical migration time frame, i.e. dusk to dawn, or like do they fly in the evenings or and then if you could repeat the name of the organization you mentioned for the best info on specific species nest box needs. Nest box needs. What was that?
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah,
sorry.
so the nesting box website is I believe it's Neighborhood Nest Watch. It's through Cornell Lab of Ornithology. So if you search um great crested flycatcher nesting box in Google or wherever, whatever, or Bing probably, Alta Vista, whatever your search engine may be. I'm not sponsored by any of them, but I will take their money. Um, but that would be one of the first things that pops up is probably a Cornell neighborhood nest watch. And that's where I get all of my nesting box plans for things. So that's pretty good. A good resource with a lot of information and fun pictures too. Yeah, and as far as when birds are migrating, so if you can actually watch it on radar at night, which is really cool. If it's a clear night and the winds are good, you basically see a bloom around every single radar station out there as the sun goes down. So birds take off maybe I'd say maybe like a half hour after sunset. So it has to get fairly dark, and then that's when they really start taking off. And they'll orient themselves using stars, but they can also detect the polarity of the Earth's magnetic field, and they use other landmarks as well, probably. Yeah, they're navigating themselves in multiple ways. But yeah, they'll often fly sometimes 400 miles a night, but they have to build up a fair amount of fat. And so the amount of time that they spend aloft is kind of reliant upon several factors. So weather conditions, how many resources they have, and sort of a suitable landing zone as well. But on heavy migration days like today, this morning in the fog, I was standing on Manomet's Bluff and I was watching several warblers come in off the water. So those birds were doing really well, and we're making great time. But then the sun came up and they're like, "Ah, I guess I better, like predators are out now. I guess I better find a spot to
Mhm.
land." So they kind of went all the way till after dawn.
Great. Thank you for that. We are going to close it out. I try and end on time so people can get back to their work day. Evan, thank you so much for sharing all about the backyard bird world and what we can do. If you enjoyed today, we'd love for you to support our work directly with a donation online if you haven't already. And if you can't get enough of the Banding Lab, we have a program, as Evan mentioned, where you can adopt your own mist net. I'm going to put that link in the chat if you feel inspired. And if you want more Manomet, please join the conversation on our socials or visit our events page online. And if you want to learn more about migration, Evan himself is going to be a guest on Marjorie Egan and Jim Broad's show, Boston Public Radio on GBH 89.7 this Friday at midday. And thanks again, Evan, and thank you to everyone who joined us today, taking your time and learn a little bit more about migration. That wraps up another edition of the Small Sit. Thanks for joining us, and we at Manomet Conservation Sciences wish you a great day. Take
Thanks,
care,
everyone.
everyone. Thanks, Evan.